Welcome to our second virtual talk for Campus Sustainability Month. My name's Danielle, and I'm the Sustainability Manager with the Office of Sustainability and Campus Enrichment. This was our second of 4 virtual talks put on by our amazing sustainability interns. These are all undergraduate students who have been working with our office since the start of this semester. They developed these talks on topics that they're curious about and undertaken the research and prepared the presentation to share what they've learned with you. Today, you'll be hearing from Kaitlyn and Kimberly. Kaitlyn's a senior in environmental studies, and Kimberly is a senior in wildlife and fisheries science. Their talk, Wolves, Bison, and Bears, Oh My, is focused on how the National Park Service has been a crucial part in conserving the beautiful ecosystem in the United States. But how did it start, and what is conservation? They're going to take you on a look back at history of the science of conservation and national parks to learn how important they are to protecting our amazing lands. Before we get into that, a couple of announcements. The first thing, to give you a couple of Zoom tips to make sure you have the best experience with us live. Recommend putting it into side-by-side mode. I have also provided the option for live transcript. You have to turn that on your own computer. So if you go to your Zoom settings and the 3 dots and hit more, there'll be an option for transcript. And then you'll get to see an AI generated subtitles that will tell you what folks are seeing if you're having challenges hearing. Ask your questions in the Q&A box. If you can't find the Q&A box, the chat is fine. And then this one should be a no-brainer. When you entered, it told you that you're recording. We're recording this so that folks can watch after the fact online, and it'll be uploaded to YouTube so that we can make sure that these great talks are shared across our campus community and beyond. A few more announcements. This talk is a part of Campus Sustainability Month, and throughout Campus Sustainability Month, it's a chance to be entered into our grand prize drawings for the month. Every code word you collect this month gives you an entry into that random drawing giveaway. For this talk, there will be one code word written on a PowerPoint slide or spoken or written in the chat. Hint, hint, I think it's in a slide. And then in addition, there will be an additional 4 code words that I will drop in the chat for those who are attending live. So if you attended live, you're going to get some extra chances to get into our giveaway. So keep track of those code words and then submit them all in one email to sustainability@tamu.edu at the end of the month, and you'll be entered to win some prizes. If you want some more details, you can visit text.ag/CSM prizes for more details. But I also want to plug another piece that's going on right now, which is our sustainability internship recruitment. Right now, we're recruiting for our next amazing batch of 8 undergraduate internships. This is open to all majors of undergrad. And if you like what you heard from our students today and you think you might have what it takes to be a sustainability internship, learn more at text.ag/sustainableapply and get your applications in by November 10th. Thinking about that Campus Sustainability Month, if you needed any more incentive to participate in our great activities this month, here's a look at some of the prizes. Top prize on this Tier 1 list to me is that $250 scholarship. In Tier 2, I've heard really good things about the double hammock. And then in Tier 3, I think the Stanley Tumbler has always been a big hit. And maybe last semester we saw some people pick up a really cool solar charger. So great prizes, really encourage you to get involved. Some additional opportunities outside of today to get those code words. You can see the recap of our talk from last Friday, which was Should I Stay or Should I Go? What hurricane ratings fail to communicate, by visiting text.ag/hurricane rating. That's a link to the YouTube recording, and you'll be able to get one code word for watching that after the fact. And then if you want a chance of 5 code words, come join us live on Monday, where Michael and Ellie will take us through Is Fair Trade Truly Effective? A case study in 2 industries. They'll be looking at the coffee industry and fast fashion. And then our final of 4 intern talks is going to be the Hitchhiker's Guide to Urban Sprawl. That is on October 23rd. Join Alyssa and Amrita to get some ideas on how we could apply 15-minute cities in some community assets that you might be already aware of. All right. Without further ado, then I'm going to pass it over to Kaitlyn and Kimberly to start their talk on wolves, bisons, and bears. Oh my. Kaitlyn, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you. Okay, so howdy. We're gonna start off first defining what exactly conservation is. So there are many definitions for conservation, but a good generalization is that conservation is the science of protecting the Earth's natural resources like ecosystem services, wildlife, plants, water systems that have all been disturbed by human activities or other agents. And the goal here is to provide quality resources for current and future generations to use. This is very important because ecosystems can be very fragile and changes can disrupt homeostasis. And humans, plants, and animals use natural resources to survive and create food webs. And we also just like to enjoy nature, so it's crucial that we protect and repair any ecosystem damage. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of conservation and the conservation agencies. I have a few arrows here just kind of connecting which agency focuses on that type of conservation. In reality, they do focus on all of them. These are just the main ones that I've labeled right here. So some of the most important popular types of conservation would be conservation biology, which is the science of protecting biodiversity and biotic interactions. There's also soil conservation, wildlife conservation, forest conservation, cultural conservation, which is very important and often overlooked. And that's the conservation of cultural and historical sites and regions. And there's also marine and water conservation, which kind of go hand in hand. As for our conservation agencies, these are just some of the main ones, and this is also focused here on the United States. So first I have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they work to protect and conserve wildlife and natural habitat areas, and they're also working to manage the endangered species populations here in the United States. There's also the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and they work to protect marine and wetland habitats. They also manage fish populations and do a lot of weather research and information. We have the Environmental Protection Agency, which is responsible for regulating and enforcing environmental regulation. The National Park Service, which is there to conserve the park areas, and they also are responsible for conserving the historical and cultural sites. And then lastly, the U.S. Forest Service, which is responsible for managing forests and forest health and also restoring any damaged forests. Okay, so to get a better understanding of the history of conservation and how it has evolved, it's important to look at a timeline. So when the settlers first came to North America, they used the natural resources as they wanted. They were overhunting and overfishing. They were polluting their water sources and were not managing their resources properly in general. This is known as the era of exploitation, which led to a lot of ecological problems for the future. So starting in 1760, that is around the time when the Industrial Revolution begins. And so we saw an increase of factories and urbanization, and humans started doing more damage to the environment because of that. And this was a pretty long period of time. It was about 80 years. In 1872, jumping forward a little bit longer, Yellowstone was named the first national park, and this was in part established by Congress for the public to enjoy. But at the time, it wasn't super focused on conservation, and eventually the National Park Service was created. In 1892, the Sierra Club was founded by John Muir, and they do a lot of environmental activism in the US, and they still currently do that to this day. In 1905, the U.S. Forest Service was established. Once again, they're focused on forest health. In 1962, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was released. And this is a piece describing the effects of the pesticide DDT on ecosystems. And it became a very popular and very controversial piece of work. So it actually helped start the environmental movement of the 1970s in the United States. And it was the start of the environmental protection decade and the era where people started to realize the damage being done to the planet. So they started to create legislation to aid in decreasing these impacts. Following that, in 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, was passed. And that's a law that oversees environmental impacts for federal agencies and companies. So if they want to propose any project or build something new, they have to explain it to NEPA, and they also have to explain any environmental impacts and alternatives for the project. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and that is to protect and rehabilitate endangered and at-risk species here in the United States. And lastly, in 1983, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act was passed, and that focuses on protecting non-game fish and wildlife and their habitats. And so these are just some of the main points of the history here in the United States, but there are also several more that have taken place that have culminated to the environmental movement. Okay, now we're going to take a look at conservation worldwide. So, conservation is a worldwide issue, and there are a lot of international agencies and treaties created. The first one I have here is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, also known as CITES. And their main goal is to manage and protect species from international trade. So the member countries work together to report any illegal trade activity. There's also the Convention on Biological Diversity, and they're responsible for conserving biological diversity and the fair share of genetic resources across the member countries. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, manages and collects data for the IUCN Red List and for endangered and threatened species. Currently, there are more than 43,000 species threatened by extinction worldwide. And then lastly, I have the Kyoto Protocol, which is a treaty that aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to decrease climate change. Okay, and then I also have some conservation tips that can be very helpful for the environment, and a lot of them are pretty easy to follow as well. So the first one is to follow hunting and fishing regulations. Overhunting and overfishing can create unbalanced ecosystems and food webs, and the regulations are pretty easy to find. You can find them online or other government resources. You should also pick up any trash in natural spaces. And so this is that animals don't consume the harmful materials, and they can't be broken down into the earth and infiltrate our water and our soil systems. Another one is to not introduce invasive species. This is really easy to do. You just have to be careful when visiting new environments, new countries, and especially cave ecosystems. So don't bring back any foreign plants or animals because invasive species can harm native species and ecosystems by increasing competition. You can also dispose of chemicals properly. Chemical waste can be harmful in water sources. A lot of times on the bottle, it'll tell you how to dispose of it, but you can also look up where you can safely dispose of the chemicals. Another tip is to plant native plants, and this is to encourage pollination and decrease competition between from non-native species. You can also educate yourself. There are many great and accessible resources. We pretty much have the internet at our fingertips today, so it's really easy to just find an article, read it, or go out and find a book and read that. And then the last tip I have is to visit the national and state parks. You can learn a lot from them, and also when you're visiting them, you should try to follow the Leave No Trace methodology. So Leave No Trace was created to limit the effects of human activities on the natural environment and make sure that the environment is protected and respected. And these principles can be practiced really in any natural space. This is just directly from the National Park Service and what they recommend. So the first one is to plan ahead and prepare. Number two is to travel and camp on durable surfaces. Three is dispose of waste properly. Four is leave what you find. Five is minimize campfire impacts. Six is respect wildlife. And seven is be considerate of other visitors. So when you're in a natural area, just try to keep these things in mind. Oh, we have a code word. Okay, so you've heard me talk a little bit about the National Park Service, and they are a good example of conservation in the US today, but the history of the national parks and their current uses do not always go hand in hand with the topic of conservation in biodiversity and public enjoyment. So the national parks have faced numerous conservation challenges when caught between preservation and human interests. So I'm going to pass it on to Kimberly so she can tell you about the very interesting history of the national parks.
Thank you. So when we think of the national parks, our minds usually go to lands that were set aside for the public enjoyment of people, no matter their socioeconomic class. But it really hasn't always been that way. We had to start somewhere, and national parks were a completely new precedent. Historically, parks have only been made for the elite and they're historically exclusive. This began to change in 1858 with the establishment of Central Park in New York City. This was the first example of a park set aside just for public enjoyment for the citizens living it there. In the mid 1800s, Niagara Falls started to get a lot of tourism, especially from Europe, to see the natural wonders of North America. However, when Europeans got there, they saw that Niagara Falls was heavily commercialized since it was so touristy. Profiteers would charge tourists to see the best viewpoints of the falls, and there were just hotels all over the area. So when these tourists went home to their countries, they would write about how the US had completely blundered at taking care of the waterfall. So this became a huge embarrassment for the American government because we wanted to be taken seriously. And we saw redemption out west where there was still a lot of wilderness to protect to recover our tarnished image. So a big difference between Europe and the USA. Europe has a lot of cultural heritage through artifacts and old buildings, while the USA doesn't have that much Western history because it's such a young country. So the US's cultural heritage potential is mainly through land, which could be used as symbols of national pride. Around this time, there was a lot of media attention that got people interested in the wilderness out west. So John Coulter was a member of the Lewis and Clark Party, and in 1809, he escaped the Blackfeet tribe and became the first white man to wander through what is now Yellowstone National Park. It's noted that this took place in 1809, so this was long before the first national park was established. But he would write in the press how he saw steaming pots of hell out in what is now Wyoming, which we know are geysers and hot springs. Truman Everts was another explorer who in 1870 got lost in the wilderness for 40 days. And what's really important about his story is when he was rescued, he confirmed Coulter's claims, which really got people interested. So some artistic depictions during this time of the natural world and Yellowstone in particular really got people intrigued about it. And during this time, the Industrial Revolution was all over the Northeast. Factories were being built, smog was being released into the air, cities were super crowded. So these artistic depictions of nature kind of served as escapism for people living in the Northeast. Henry David Thoreau was a famous writer during this time, and he wrote very romantically about nature. I have a quote of his here. I believe that there is a subtle magnetism in nature, which if we unconsciously yield to it, will direct us aright. So you can see that these writings speak very highly of nature. In 1872, the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone was painted by Thomas Moran, and this painting was something that really inspired the government to protect Yellowstone National Park. So in 1872, Ulysses S. Grant signed a law turning 2.2 million acres of wilderness into Yellowstone National Park. This was the first national park in the United States and the world. And these boundaries haven't really changed very much from when it was first established. So just because Yellowstone had become a national park didn't mean it was very well protected, since there was no National Park Service to actually regulate the lands. Two key conservationists during this time really shaped the national park system that we know today. John Muir was a naturalist, a huge national park advocate, and the president and founder of the Sierra Club. He was also key in the formation of Yosemite National Park, which was created in 1890. And he would also go on to advocate for many, many more national parks created during this time. Theodore Roosevelt was the 26th president of the United States, and his idea of conservation was more in line with we need lands to go hunting on because he was a huge sportsman. But he toured the Sierra Nevada mountains with John Muir in 1903, and that's what this picture is depicting in Yosemite Valley. And after this trip, he saw a lot of potential in protecting these beautiful landscapes for the American people, more on the side of protecting the scenery for future generations. And during his term as president, he created 5 new national parks. Another way Roosevelt protected the national parks is through the Antiquities Act. So this was a loophole that allowed the president to establish national monuments for objects of historical or scientific interest. Roosevelt wasn't able to make parks directly because that was Congress's job, but he could create or protect land by creating national monuments. This allowed him to circumvent Congress, which was around this time very apathetic to the conservation movement and would listen to a lot of lobbyists that would want to have cattle on that land or have logging operations on that land. And at this time, this was seen as controversial because it was seen as a big overreach of power when Roosevelt would create a national monument such as the Grand Canyon in 1908, which is a huge expanse of land that's not just a couple artifacts that the Antiquities Act was mainly created for. But Roosevelt was able to create 18 national monuments in this way, and nearly a quarter of units currently in the NPS system, in whole or part, come from the Antiquities Act. So some national monuments that were established was Montezuma Castle National Monument in 1906 and Devil's Tower National Monument in 1906. And Roosevelt was able to establish protection for both of these cultural artifacts or cultural areas. And here are some national monuments that would later on become national parks, such as the Grand Canyon and Olympic. Those were both created by Roosevelt. But these other national parks were created first as monuments and then became national parks later on that were made by other presidents. So the Antiquities Act had a lot of lasting effects on the national park system. There were some setbacks. Hetch Hetchy Valley is it's 3 miles long and about 1,200 acres. And the city of San Francisco needed more water supply after a devastating earthquake in the early 1900s. Roosevelt wasn't president anymore, and a less sympathetic president was in office. So in 1913, Woodrow Wilson signed a bill approving the dam into law so that San Francisco could have this water. In 1923, the dam was completed and the valley flooded. And this had some very dangerous implications for the national park system because if a valley within a national park could be flooded, then what's stopping other operations from forming in other national parks? And this kind of shows a conflict between human needs and the natural world. Do we strictly preserve these lands, or do we have a way of practicing good stewardship while also providing for human needs? So in 1929, the Great Depression struck the United States. And President Franklin Roosevelt needed a way to get young Americans working again so they could earn money to send back to their families. This resulted in FDR's New Deal, which also utilized the national parks to help young men out. He introduced a relief program to provide work, and this revitalized the national park system. NPS, the National Park Protection Service, was created in 1915, but it wasn't very well utilized until after FDR's New Deal. So he established the Civilian Conservation Corps and he built roads and trails within the park. So this allowed many more tourists to come to the national parks to see the beauty of the parks and tell their friends and family about it. So more people were on board with protecting them. The parks today. So one thing to note is the perception of national parks has really changed throughout their history. They started out as symbols of national pride, and there was a very narrow view that we need to just protect scenic landscapes. This began to change, and then they were used as protected lands for public recreation for the American people to enjoy. And then finally, people began to realize their ecological significance and that they were necessary for biodiversity conservation and not just beautiful scenery. There are now 63 national parks, 134 national monuments, and NPS manages 431 units and over 85 million acres of land. This trend also went worldwide, and we have 1,200 national parks all over the world. Another way the National Park Service has changed is there's more recognition of Indigenous history. So, for the creation of national parks, many Native Americans were removed and forcibly displaced. And this is truly a black mark on national park history. This is in part due to the pristine wilderness theory, where many people around this time thought that humans were inherently flawed and would destroy nature just by their presence. But this is untrue because for generations, Native Americans lived on the lands and were good stewards of that land. So today, NPS, NPF, and tribal partners collaborate to try and protect more of Native American cultural history. We can see this in 2015. President Obama changed the name of Mount McKinley to Mount Denali, which is the original Indigenous name, to honor cultural history. Also in 2003, bison herd was released on the Blackfeet Reservation near Glacier National Park, and this marks the first return of bison on this land in 150 years. National parks also have had some conservation challenges more recently. There's more conflict between what human needs and what is good for the environment.
Okay, so this is a really interesting case study from Yellowstone National Park that kind of connects the importance of wildlife conservation with the establishment of the national parks. So the gray wolf was present in Yellowstone before the late 1800s, and then slowly the gray wolf populations were killed off by humans just because they thought they were a nuisance and they weren't benefiting them. And so for about 90 years, there were no gray wolves left in Yellowstone. There were a few rare sightings every once in a while, but there were no established packs of wolves. And so they just weren't there anymore. And they were reintroduced in the 1990s. It took about 6 years for them to be successfully reintroduced. And since then, they have been listed and unlisted as an endangered species. But it really just depends on the state because Yellowstone takes up more than one state, and also it depends on the year. But right now they are currently delisted and there are about 10 established wolf packs. And so the effects from reintroducing the wolves back into Yellowstone were actually kind of unexpected. So there was the expected effect of the wolves on the elk population. They were controlling the elk population. So while they were gone, the elk had no predators. And so they would go through these population like boom and busts where their population would increase and then they wouldn't have enough resources. So then it would decrease and they would start to die off and then it would increase again. And it was just a cycle over and over again because there's really no predator for them. And so once the wolves came and started controlling the elk, there was also a change in vegetation because there were less elk eating that vegetation. So there were there was more vegetation. The diversity of the vegetation was the same, but there was more of it. The rivers also changed a little bit because there was less erosion from the elk walking around the rivers. And that's because they had to change their behaviors because now they had a predator in the park. So it was really interesting to see how the reintroduction of one animal in such a huge place can make so many changes. And then just a few takeaways between the conservation and the National Park Service. Once again, the National Park Service has shifted towards conservation. That is not how it started out. And we learned the history about that today. The national parklands, they benefit more than one party. So they benefit not only the species that they house there, but also the humans that want to come visit, and the economy as well. The national parks here in the United States are a big tourist attraction. And so they bring in a lot of money and they also employ a lot of people. And lastly, conservation is important inside and outside of the parks. So conservation is not just taking place in the national parks, it's taking place in the state parks, the city parks, the ranches, and all over the world. So it's a very important topic, and I'm glad that the National Park Service has shifted more towards that and focusing on that and providing great resources for us to continue protecting our natural earth. Okay, I think that's it. Does anyone have any questions?
Thank you, Kaitlyn and Kimberly. That was a great and informative presentation. If there's anyone who has questions, they can drop them in the chat or unmute themselves to ask.
I have a question. I noticed there's one in the chat, but I'll ask mine first. First off, I learned so much, things I just had no idea about the Park Service. So thank you for your research and putting this on. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to narrow my question down to one that's pretty specific. Kaitlyn, you mentioned the case study with the wolf reintroduction, and I think it said that there are 10 wolf packs. Do you happen to have any idea how many wolves might live in a wolf pack?
I am not sure. I know it is more than, I think it said it was more than 6 because there are over 100, it's about 124 wolves in Yellowstone. That's what their population is counted as of right now. But there are those 124 wolves make up 10 different packs.
That gives me enough sense of scale of that. So thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And then a question in the chat for you is, can you expand on how you would dispose of trash properly to leave no trace?
So the easiest way to do that is to, firstly, you can use reusable types of packaging and stuff and just bring less trash with you while you are on those natural areas. But another way is to just take it home with you and throw it away when you get home. That way you're not just leaving it in the grass or in the middle of the road where some animal could digest it or something like that.
Awesome. I thank you both, Kimberly and Kaitlyn. I think that's all we have. And I thank everyone who joined us today and is watching online. Remember, your code word for watching live was wilderness. There are 4 more in the chat. Make sure you write them down and submit them for our Campus Sustainability Month giveaway. And hopefully some folks will join us on Monday for our next Campus Sustainability Chat. So thank you so much, Kaitlyn and Kimberly. Everyone have a great day.